All right, get ready, because today we're going deep on how some European far-right parties, well, they kind of use the EU itself to gain power.
It's a really interesting case study. We tend to think of these parties as like totally against the EU, but it's way more complicated than that.
Yeah, for sure. Our guide for this deep dive is an article. It's by Marta Lorimer. She's an expert on far-right politics, and it's published in Politics and Rights Review. She looks specifically at two groups, Italy's Movimento Sociale Italiano, or MSI. They later became the Alleanza Nazionale, and then France's Rassemblement National.
The thing is, both these parties started out as fringe movements, like way out there. And yet they somehow managed to transform themselves into, like, serious contenders for power. Lorimer argues that the EU, maybe accidentally, actually played a role in this whole transformation.
Hold on. So the EU was basically funding its own critics. How did that even happen?
Well, not directly, but the EU did give these parties resources. Financial resources, electoral resources, even symbolic ones, which they then used to their advantage.
Okay, that's a serious aha moment. So they weren't just like yelling from the outside. They were working the system from within to gain legitimacy and influence.
Exactly. They did this by strategically changing their image and how they talked about things, often appealing to, like mainstream values, while still pushing their nationalist agenda. Lorimer identifies four key strategies that they used.
Okay, I'm all ears. Let's hear them.
So the first one is this appeal to a shared European identity. And I know that might sound kind of weird for nationalist parties, but they were smart. They separated the EU as like a political institution from Europe as like a cultural and historical entity.
So they were basically saying, we're not against Europe. We're against what the EU is doing to our Europe. Kind of a subtle but powerful difference.
Right. Exactly. They positioned themselves as protectors of European identity, and they tacked into those anxieties about globalization and, cultures becoming too similar.
Makes sense. What about the second strategy?
So they took the idea of liberty and reframed it. Instead of focusing on individual liberties, which, might not work with their more authoritarian views, they emphasized the freedom of the nation as a whole and of Europe as a whole.
So less about individual rights, more about the nation's right to, self-determination.
Exactly. And this let them kind of align themselves with these like mainstream values like freedom and sovereignty, and it made their message, well, more appealing to a bigger audience.
Clever. Okay, what was number 3?
All right, so this one's called Europe in Danger. Both the Movimento Sociale Italiano and the Rassemblement National, they always portrayed Europe as facing these existential threats. Threats from both inside and out.
Wow, that's intense. Like, what kind of threats?
Oh, they used everything. From the Soviet Union back during the Cold War to, the threat of American cultural imperialism to mass immigration to, demographic decline. They were really good at exploiting anxieties and fears.
So by always pointing out these threats, they made themselves look like the protectors, the defenders of a Europe under siege. It's like they flipped the script. They weren't the radicals. They were the saviors.
Yeah, exactly. And by creating the sense of urgency and fear, they justified their more extreme positions as necessary responses to these threats.
That's fascinating. Okay, so what about the fourth and final strategy?
This one's all about national interest. Both parties, they consistently frame their positions on EU issues as about protecting the interests of their own countries.
Seems like a pretty straightforward way to appeal to their nationalist voters.
Yeah, it is. But it's also more than that. By constantly talking about national interests, they were able to attract new voters who maybe weren't happy with the EU, but weren't necessarily drawn to far-right ideas. It let them broaden their appeal without changing their core principles.
That's pretty clever. They were appealing to their base while also expanding their reach at the same time. Okay, so we've got these four main strategies: European identity, liberty, Europe in danger, and national interest. How did these actually play out in real-world politics?
Let's start with Italy. The Movimento Sociale Italiano, MSI, they started out as like a neo-fascist group after the war.
Wow, so they were about as fringe as it gets. How did they go from that to, being part of a governing coalition in the 90s? That's a pretty big change.
Yeah, it is. And the EU actually played a part, although not in the way you might think. At first, the MSI, they were super skeptical of European integration. They saw it as a threat to Italian sovereignty, They even boycotted the first direct elections for the European Parliament.
So they just rejected the EU completely at first.
Yeah, exactly. But then as the EU gained more power and influence, the MSI realized they couldn't just ignore it. They needed a new plan.
So that's when they started using those four strategies. strategies, right? To like rebrand themselves and gain some legitimacy within the EU.
Exactly. They started to emphasize this idea of a Europe of nations, arguing for, a more decentralized EU that respected national identities and sovereignty. This let them use that European identity thing while still promoting their nationalist agenda.
And this helped them get a wider audience, right?
Yeah.
Voters who might have been wary of their, neo-fascist past, but were drawn to their message of national pride and European unity. It's like they wanted it both ways.
Yeah, it was a really effective strategy. They also used the liberty framing, arguing that Italy needed to be free from, the control of Brussels and that real European liberty was in a union of strong, independent nations.
So they were aligning themselves with this positive idea of freedom while also kind of undermining the EU's authority at the same time.
Exactly. And don't forget the Europe in danger strategy. The MSI, they were really good at exploiting fears about immigration, especially from North Africa.
Yeah, the classic far-right playbook. Scapegoating immigrants and, stirring up anxieties about cultural change.
Right. They presented themselves as the only ones who could protect Italy and Europe from this threat. And they used it to justify their hardline stance on immigration.
So they were basically using a real issue, immigration, which the EU was dealing with, to their own political advantage.
Exactly. And they never missed a chance to emphasize the national interest, arguing that any EU policy that didn't directly benefit Italy was like a betrayal of Italian sovereignty.
This makes me think about some of those specific policies we talked about earlier. Did the MSI actually manage to influence any EU policies through this focus on national interest?
Yeah, they actually did. They were pretty successful in getting agricultural subsidies for Italian farmers and pushing for stricter border controls in the Mediterranean. They presented these as victories for Italy, proof that they were fighting for, the interests of their people.
So they could point to real examples of how being in the EU was benefiting Italians, which, of course, made them look more legitimate and strengthen their position.
Exactly. And as they got more power and influence, their rhetoric started to sound more mainstream, less obviously neo-fascist. This rebranding was really important for them to eventually be accepted into, the Italian political establishment.
It's like they used the EU as a way to refine their image.
Yeah.
Like a finishing school, until they were acceptable enough to join the mainstream.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And their success, it kind of showed other far-right parties that they could follow a similar path.
Okay, so we've seen how the MSI used the EU to go from a fringe movement to a real political force in Italy. What about the Rassemblement National in France? Did they use, similar strategies?
They did, but there are some interesting differences. The Rassemblement National, which used to be the Front National, they were also really hostile to the EU at first.
Right. Their leader, Jean-Marie Le Pen, he was famously anti-EU. He even called the European Parliament a curtain-twitching old people's home, if I remember correctly. Not exactly a positive endorsement.
Nope. Not at all. But just like the MSI, the Front National, which later became the Rassemblement National under Marine Le Pen, they realized they couldn't just ignore the EU. They had to engage with it, but on their own terms,
So how did they change their approach to fit within the EU? Did they also, embrace that European identity strategy?
They did, but they added a kind of exclusionary twist. Instead of focusing on a shared European culture, they emphasized this idea of a Christian Europe. They drew a clear line between Europe and the Muslim world.
So they were using the European identity strategy, but to push their own vision of a, culturally homogenous Christian Europe, which, fits with their anti-immigration stance.
Exactly. They tapped into those anxieties about the so-called Islamization of Europe, and they presented themselves as the defenders of, European values and traditions.
That's a strong message, especially in a country like France, with its history of secularism and its, complex relationship with Islam.
Right. And they used the liberty framing, too, arguing that France needed to be free from what they saw as the dictates of Brussels. They said that true European liberty was about a union of sovereign nations.
So in some ways, their approach is similar to the MSI's, emphasizing national sovereignty and freedom from, EU control.
Yeah, but they were even more critical of the EU, often describing it as this undemocratic, bureaucratic monster that was eroding French sovereignty and national identity.
That's definitely more aggressive than the MSI.
Yeah.
Did they also use that Europe in danger strategy?
Oh, absolutely. They were experts at it. They constantly talked about the threat of immigration, globalization, and cultural decline. They painted this picture of France as a nation under threat.
And this let them justify their hardline policies, like restricting immigration, promoting those traditional values, and protecting French culture from, what they saw as foreign influences.
Exactly. They were very good at tapping into those anxieties and fears, and they used that to get political support. And of course, they always talked about the national interest. They argued that any EU policy that didn't directly benefit France was like a betrayal of French sovereignty.
So they were able to appeal to a lot of different voters,
Yeah.
right? From people who were worried about immigration and cultural change to those who really believed in their vision of a strong, independent France.
Yes, and their success, even with their sometimes, inflammatory rhetoric, shows how effective those four strategies can be in European politics.
It makes you think, the EU is supposed to be about unity and cooperation, but it can also be a platform for division and nationalist agendas. It's complicated. Okay, we've seen how these two parties, the MSI and the Rassemblement National, use these strategies to their advantage. What about the EU itself? How has the rise of these far-right parties impacted the EU as a whole?
Yeah, that's a huge question. The rise of these far-right parties, it's really shaken things up in the EU. It's not just about them getting seats in parliament. It's more like, a ripple effect.
So how's the EU responded to this rise in far-right sentiment? They didn't just sit back and watch, did they?
Well, not exactly. They've tried a few things. For one, they've put more money into programs that promote tolerance and intercultural dialogue and critical thinking.
Yeah.
The idea is to counter those far-right narratives, and build up some resistance to extremist ideas.
Makes sense, I guess. Education and awareness seem like pretty key tools in fighting these kinds of movements. But have these programs actually worked?
It's tough to say for sure. Some people say they've helped raise awareness and promote a more inclusive vision of Europe. Others say they haven't really been effective in dealing with the deeper anxieties and issues that fuel far-right sentiment.
So mixed results. What else has the EU tried?
Well, there's been a lot of debate about how to deal with these parties, right within the EU institutions. Some people say they should be more confrontational, censure them, or even kick out far-right MEPs who break EU rules. Others say they should be more pragmatic, try to have a dialogue, and maybe find common ground on some issues.
So it's a tricky situation. The EU wants to uphold its values and principles,
Yeah.
but it doesn't want to alienate a big chunk of voters either.
Exactly. And there's no easy solution. The EU is still trying to figure out how to deal with this challenge.
It is interesting how these parties, even with their different goals sometimes, they've had such a big impact on the EU. Do you think this influence is going to continue? I mean, look at parties like the Brothers of Italy, basically the successors to the Internazionale. They've had some major wins lately.
Yeah, it's definitely something to watch. The things that have, fueled the far right's rise, economic worries, fears about immigration and cultural change, people being disillusioned with politics, all that stuff is still happening in Europe.
So even though those four strategies we talked about, the European identity, liberty, Europe in danger, and national interest, they might seem kind of obvious to some, they're obviously still working on a lot of voters.
Yeah, they are. And until those anxieties and problems are dealt with, the far right will probably keep using them.
That's a bit worrying. Seems like the EU is facing some pretty big challenges, both from inside and out.
Yeah, it is. And the future of the EU, well, it's definitely uncertain. But one thing's for sure, understanding how these far-right parties have used EU resources and rhetoric, it's really important, not just for understanding European politics, but for seeing the bigger challenges that democracies around the world are facing.
That's a good point. This isn't just a Europe thing, it's global. We're seeing far-right populism on the rise in a lot of places.
Yeah.
And knowing the strategies they use, well, that's key to pushing back.
Exactly. We need to be aware, stay informed, and be active if we want to make sure that democratic values and institutions, they win out.
Well said. So good enough to end on. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive into, well, the world of European far-right politics. It's complicated and a little unsettling, but it's something we need to pay attention to because, it matters. It matters for the future of Europe and for the whole world, really.